All right, welcome back. This session is online session 3 about fluency and vocabulary assessment and instruction. The things that you will need today will be you'll need your online session outline for session 3, as well as access to the internet. There will be several opportunities along the way to stop and consult some outside resources and do a little bit of research on the internet, as well as your Write-Sloan Cooter text and your 3-minute reading assessments. Also, if you have any other informal reading inventories, such as the qualitative reading inventory, you can take that out. So you might want to have a plethora of materials available as we work through this online session. All right, so what is reading fluency? Well, you probably knew what reading fluency was long before you opened up this text and read this chapter on it, because you've clearly had training on it as well as training in the STEP assessment. So you probably understand the 3 dimensions, but to go over them really quickly, a really inclusive definition of fluency is accurate reading at a reasonable rate with prosody. And the National Reading Panel includes these 3 dimensions of reading fluency, which the authors of your text actually argue that there's 4, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But that that fluency is 3 things. It's not just accurate reading, and it's not just fast reading, but it's prosodic reading, reading with expression, intonation, and paying attention to contextual and syntactical cues along the way, like question marks and exclamation marks, etc., as well as chunking and phrasing. And the National Reading Panel has sort of noted that that fluency may possibly be the bridge between word recognition and text comprehension. And there are several researchers who have also hypothesized this and are doing a considerable amount of work in trying to understand if fluency is indeed this bridge between word recognition and text comprehension. We've also been warned by researchers that assessing only one aspect of fluency is dangerous. And we know that we oftentimes interpret assessments to inform instruction. And if we're only assessing either accurate reading or reading at a reasonable rate, then that may, in turn, our instruction may be to produce accurate and quick readers, but not necessarily readers who are comprehending the material. So it's a really important thing to consider when using a fluency assessment measure, is what aspects or what dimensions of fluency is it assessing. And ultimately, we give that warning because the goal of fluent reading is not rapid word calling. There's a big difference between word calling and then being able to attach meaning to those words. But rather, the goal for fluent reading is for more energy and attention to be allocated for reading comprehension. So that's why researchers have often hypothesized that fluency is the bridge between word recognition and text comprehension, so that fluent readers can give more energy and more attention for reading comprehension. So children who are fluent readers can recognize words automatically, group words quickly to help them, chunking or phrasing, can gain meaning from what they've read, and read aloud effortlessly and with expression. Now obviously we think back to child's stages of reading development, and we think about the students that we teach. So obviously 1st and 2nd graders may be less fluent readers because they're attending to the print-sound relationships, as well as trying to make sense of irregular words and high-frequency words and how all of that is put together, so they're glued to the print, so to speak. So they're less likely to be quote-unquote fluent readers, whereas 3rd graders, we expect more fluent reading from typically developing readers in 3rd grade. So clearly you have to think about child's stages, where your student fits in, and then what types of fluency assessment are you going to use. In the 3-minute assessment, Rosinski and Padak they give that caveat that when we look at 1st graders, our expectations of accurate and fluent reading are different than when we look at 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. So keep that in mind as you work with your students. So how do we assess reading fluency? Well, we go back to those dimensions when we defined reading fluency. Obviously, we look at accuracy. That's words correct per minute. We look at reasonable rate or automaticity. That's the percent of words read correctly. And prosody. That's where the multidimensional fluency scale comes in. Being able to use some sort of rubric to get an idea of how prosthetic the child is when reading. Now the fourth one is really what your authors of your text argue. So obviously those three first dimensions that we use to assess reading fluency are in sort of the nationally recognized definition of fluency. This last one is reading endurance, which there's very little known. Your authors, Reitzel and Cooter, talk about this quite a bit, that it's still in the works. And this notion of reading endurance is being able to accurately read at a reasonable rate with prosody over an extended amount of time, with the goal for comprehension, the goal in mind being comprehending the material. Now obviously there's little known about this, so our best way to assess that is through anecdotal notes at the time or observation. But this may be something that you could consider making a checklist, something similar to what you all did for the oral language competencies, or the Common Core oral language, where you have a checklist and you have reading endurance as part of it, and you're looking at whether or not the child is proficient, developing, or emerging with regard to reading endurance at certain times in the year. Researchers hypothesize that this notion of reading endurance is something that not only helps students attain to meaning and make meaning, but also that it is something that the more fluent a reader is for a greater amount of time, the more that they're going to engage in reading. That's sort of one of the hypotheses right now about reading endurance. So what I'd like you to do next is I'd like you to go to this website and think about what are some assessments I can use to gauge student reading fluency. And this is actually an educational material put out by PREL, or the Pacific Resources for Education and Learning, and it's written by Tim Rosinski, and there were a few other folks that helped provide some assistance, David Shard, Melanie Kuhn, and Wayne Leineck, who are all sort of leading researchers in reading fluency. What I'd like you to do is read through this. He not only defines reading fluency, which I think you'll find is jives well with your text, but he also provides different assessments, and he talks about oral reading fluency, or CBMs, which is a very popular progress monitoring tool for fluency, as well as he talks through multidimensional reading fluency scales. He talks about creating a classroom fluency chart. Some things that I think you'll find interesting, as well as will support what you read in the text. So if you would take time to read through that, and then next on the PowerPoint, if you would go to the online session and think about choosing 2 assessments. I want you to pick one informal reading inventory. That's something that you're going to have to sort of research a little bit on your own. You could use, if you wanted to, the 3-minute assessment. It's kind of an adaptation of an informal reading inventory. You could use the qualitative reading inventory. That's up to you which informal reading inventory you use. And then to choose one other assessment, so that could be an ORF, a CBM ORF, or that could be another fluency assessment from your text, or you could choose the step portion. That's up to you, but I want you to think about these 5 questions with regard to looking at those 2 assessments. What aspects of fluency are assessed? That's important to understand the dimensions that are assessed. What is the reliability and validity, and if that information is available? If it's not, what do you think about that? Then what type of test is the assessment? So thinking back to our different types of tests: screening, progress monitoring, outcome testing, or diagnostic. And then when could you and why would you use these assessments? So that kind of backs up that 3rd question. And then last, what criticisms has this assessment received? Now, if you cannot find, that means you got to do a little Googling to find if there's any criticisms about the actual assessment. If you have difficulty finding anything about that, think about your criticisms. You're an informed and critical consumer and an expert in the classroom. So think about what your criticisms of that assessment are. So please take time now to do that portion. All right. The next thing I'd like for you to consider is to read through the 3-minute assessments thoroughly. Really read through the introduction as well as all of the components in the introduction. So that's moving through pages 5 through 12. Taking a look at the multidimensional fluency scale as well as the comprehension rubric. Then I'd like for you to take a look at the different reading passages themselves. Familiarize yourself with how to give the assessment, and then to in turn thinking about how to score the assessment results. Also, something you may want to think about is on pages 59 through pages 63 are some quick bulleted information about word recognition instruction, fluency instruction, and comprehension instruction. So Rosinski and Paddock give you some ideas, not only, okay, here's how you give the assessment, this is what, but also once you've interpreted it, if you find that it's a word recognition difficulty or a fluency or a comprehension, here are some ideas to support that. So please, at this time, really familiarize yourself with the 3-minute assessment. If you need to, there's another Camtasia video on Edmodo in folder 3. So now that you have looked at assessments for reading fluency, you've thought about 2 different types of assessments for reading fluency, and you've looked at the 3-minute assessment in depth, it's important to ask yourselves, when do I teach reading fluency? And it's kind of that notion that, okay, I've got these assessment results now, what do I do with them? Not only formal and informal assessment, but also that observation data when I'm walking around and I'm in guided reading groups and I realize that my students are not doing 1, 2, or 3 of these things. So it's a strong indication that a student needs fluency instruction if you ask the student to read orally from a text that he or she has not practiced, so a cold read, and the student makes more than 10% word recognition errors. Now obviously, thinking about reading development, a cold read would probably be more important at a 2nd, 3rd, and on up grade level than maybe at the 1st grade level. You'd have to use your best judgment there. 2, if the student cannot read orally with expression. Now obviously, we're thinking more about late 2nd, 3rd, and up. So those of you teaching in 1st grade, you may not have a whole lot of expression while they're reading, unless it's their 2nd or 3rd read through and you're asking them to really pay attention to some of the punctuation that they've learned. And then 3, if the student's comprehension is poor for the text that she or he reads orally, and obviously for younger ones, reading multiple times, having a couple of reads and still unable to comprehend the text. So what does it look like when a child cannot read orally with expression? I'm sure you all know. But an example would be where they lack expression and chunking. So brown bear, bear what? Do you see? Obviously the chunking and the phrasing is not, it doesn't match what it should. So a fluent reader would read the same line as brown bear, what do you see? Paying attention to how we chunk, obviously an adjective and a noun, and then a phrase, a common phrase, what do you see? So clearly these are things that you probably are seeing in the classroom, and you know, based on these 3, when it's time to work on reading fluency. And I think this first suggestion up here is really probably the one in which most of our assessment data can help us and help inform us. So with that said, I've got a little case study for you here. This is Precious. Precious is might have been a student I've worked with in the past. Maybe, maybe not. I'd like for you to read through Precious's case study now. Not all the information is just completely spelled out here. You got to do some thinking in order to answer the questions. So read through the case study. Then I'd like for you to answer these 6 questions, really thinking about it. So what assessments do you think were probably completed for Precious to gain this information about her? What can Precious do? Obviously, what's established, what's developing, what's emerging, and how can we intervene and or provide intentional instruction based on what we know about her? And what can we do to find out if what we are doing is indeed working? So please take some time right now and to read through Precious's case study and answer those questions. So after you've solved the greater issues for Precious, now I want you to turn to pages 208 through pages 228 in your textbook and to really read through those instructional ideas for building reading fluency. Some areas that your authors highlight that I have found particularly helpful are the bulleted points here that I have, and I'll sort of let you read through each one of those as your chapter describes them. But I am going to talk about repeated oral readings and how I've done it in the past and how I've found it to be very successful. And then I'm going to show you the Florida Center for Reading Research. This is a website you may already know, but it's a great place to get instructional ideas for varying components of reading instruction. So the first one, obviously, explicit modeling of fluent reading. That's us explicitly modeling fluent reading. And this can also be done with partners and partner reading. Something that some colleagues of mine at Texas A&M did was they used podcasting to with partner reading. So one child would read a text and another child would listen and read along, and vice versa. And it was often a way for children to explicitly model for one another fluent reading, and something that they could that sort of tapped into their engagement with this whole notion of being able to record themselves and listen to themselves. And it was pretty cool, actually, that they were able to not only share their reading with another friend, but they were actually able to stop and listen to themselves over and over, which I found to be very helpful when working with striving readers, is that if they can hear themselves read, then they can be more metacognitive about perhaps the miscues that they're making, and so that they don't get ingrained in these same patterns, but they can actually listen to themselves and stop and think about what they're doing. Obviously, duet and choral reading, your chapter talks quite a bit about that, and it even gives some suggestions about how to implement that in the classroom. Reader's theater is very popular. Sometimes it's almost even overused. But I have a handout up on Edmodo about Reader's theater. I think Reader's theater is great depending upon the text that you choose to use for Reader's theater, and then how animated you have the children get and how involved they can be. Probably the best Reader's theater I've seen is when children are allowed to dress up in some sort of fashion, whether that's a different hat depending upon the different characters in the Reader's theater, or whether that is an accent that they can bring to it. But I think the more that they're allowed to play with the notion of the character that they're reading from, the more successful and the more interesting Reader's theater can be. Otherwise, it can feel a little like round robin reading. And then repeated oral readings. This is something particularly for word recognition and for fluency, reading at an accurate and reasonable rate. With regard to those two aspects, fluency can be very helpful. I tend to do repeated oral readings in a one-on-one setting with children, or sometimes small group, and where I have 4 rereadings of a short passage. The first one is a warm-up, and that's to familiarize themselves, and I tell them explicitly, this first reading is your warm-up. The second reading, we are going to read for accuracy. We're going to try to read every word absolutely and 100% accurately. The second reading, we're going to try to read accurately and within a reasonable rate. And then the fourth reading, we're going to read with expression. So they read the same text 4 times, so they're getting repeated practice with that text, but they have a different goal in mind each time they read. Now, something that's important to understand about repeated oral readings, that is great for fluency, but not necessarily for vocabulary instruction. So don't confuse the strategy for the two areas. And the article that you're going to read here in a second for vocabulary will speak to that a little bit, why repeated oral readings really aren't that great for vocabulary, but they're great for fluency. And then, of course, wide reading. The more children read and the more engaging the texts are, the more fluent oftentimes they are at reading. Obviously, that's not for every child, but for typically developing readers. So this next thing I want to show you is the Florida Center for Reading Research. The Florida Center for Reading Research is a reading center that obviously you can see it's been awarded big grant money to operate and to do reading research, and some of the top-notch reading researchers, particularly in the fields of learning disabilities, are here at FCRR. What FCRR has done is they've compiled different student center activities based on, they've grouped them K through 1, 2 through 3, and 4 through 5. I think you'll find this really interesting. So all the resources that you can find over here on the right-hand side, I'm going to click on K through 1 and show you where to find these materials. If you scroll down, you can find obviously teacher resource guides, which has just a ton of information, as well as different books, so to speak, and these are basically PDFs that you can print off. They're huge, so don't print off the whole thing at once. But they're divided into phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, so the 5 components of the National Reading Panel. And then within each one there are different activities that can be used or adapted to support these things. So for instance, if I want to work on letter recognition, I could click on part 1. Obviously this would be something more for kindergarten, but it's going to download a file here. And what I have is, after it's downloaded these huge PDF files, is I have different activities where it provides the objective, the materials that I need, and the activity. The great thing is that the materials are often included, so you can print these off, laminate them, or obviously it could just be a place to get ideas. But there are a ton of different ideas. There's an alphabet arc, one of my personal favorites, alphabet clip. Some great, just quick and easy activities for reading centers or for small group intervention or even one-on-one intervention. So this is the Florida Center for Reading Research. Hopefully you will use some of the activities that you find there. Alright, so you've had a chance to look at some good instructional practices and some research-based instructional practices in your text, as well as get some ideas on Florida Center for Reading Research. Now it's sort of time to talk a little bit about what are some not so good instructional practices. Obviously, round-robin reading is something that has been coined ineffective, and there is research to support that. Focusing on one aspect of fluency alone, I think we've kind of talked about that quite a bit, that that's actually really dangerous to assess it and then instructionally focus only on one. And then decontextualize word recognition lists. Now obviously if you're working on you're working on your high frequency irregular words, then word recognition lists may be helpful for that. But decontextualized word recognition lists may or may not transfer to text reading. We're now going to turn the tables and talk about vocabulary instruction. Vocabulary instruction is important to students' conceptual development. I don't think anybody would argue with that. And because of that importance, it's often been coined the link to reading comprehension. You can decode all day, you can even do it fluently, but you need to understand what those words mean that you're decoding and decoding fluently. So earlier we mentioned that fluency has been hypothesized as the link, or actually the bridge really, to between word recognition and comprehension. But I think many vocabulary researchers would say that you got to have vocabulary on that bridge too. So you've read through your text through Chapter 8 on teaching and assessing vocabulary development, and you've gotten Reitzel and Cooter's point of view, which they've done a great job of synthesizing and summarizing researchers throughout. But one name that you probably read throughout the text was Beck, and oftentimes she publishes with McCown. And right now I'd like for you to read a little bit further. I'd like for you to read a research study, a fairly rigorous research study that was published in the Elementary Journal, which is a difficult journal to get published in within my field. And I'd like for you to read it. Look at the outline and consider those questions while you're reading through it. The article can be found on the folder for week 3. It's called Increasing Young, Low-Income Children's Oral Vocabulary Repertoires Through Rich and Focused Instruction. Most of Beck's work is done in inner city schools. She's at the University of Pittsburgh, and so a good deal of her research is done with young children in urban settings. So if you'll take time right now, read through those questions before you read it, and provide some rich answers. That's going to be one of your postings for this week. So take time now to do that. So now you've read and you've synthesized and you've got a better idea for what Beck did in that research, what Beck and McCown did in that research study. What I'd like you to do is to emulate that yourselves to some extent, the intervention that was provided through Text Talk. I'd like for you to choose a text or perhaps a chapter from a text you're reading with students. Next, choose 3 words to teach from that text or 3 words to teach from that chapter. Plan the teaching sequence as per the Text Talk strategy in Beck et al. And come up with how you would teach those 3 words as per the strategy that she mentions in the study. And then think about how you will assess the student's acquisition and transference of the new vocabulary words. So if you'll take time to do that right now, this will be sort of that link from understanding research and putting it into practice. Also, that strategy, just to mention this really quickly, can be found on page 256 on the right-hand column as far as how it spells it out for the Text Talk and rich instruction with regard to Text Talk. Okay, next we're going to just sort of quickly summarize how students learn new vocabulary words. And this is not new information to you. This is stuff that you've been able to extract and pull apart from the text as well as from the Beck and McCown article. Students learn new vocabulary words both explicitly and incidentally. And we know from the research study that explicitly is very important, particularly for students who may come to us with quote-unquote oral vocabularies that need support with regard to academic vocabulary. So we know that both explicit and incidental is important. As teachers, it's really key to be self-aware of not only the explicit instruction but also the incidental instruction and how you're supporting that throughout the day. One way, obviously, the Text Talk and the rich instruction is clearly a strategy that could be used to introduce vocabulary and to teach it thoroughly, but there are also other ways. And one way that Beck, McCown, and Kuchen talk about in their text, Bringing Words to Life, which I will reference at the end for you, is to think about that our language has tiers. Obviously, yes, we have conversational language, then we have more robust language, and then we have very content-specific language. And when we think about these tiers of language, they can help support what types of words to teach and when to teach them and how often to teach them. Obviously, conversational language is language that is basic vocabulary, approximately 8,000 words, and it rarely requires a whole lot of instructional attention. because these are words that are used in everyday conversation and used quite frequently. These are typically words that we see in children's early reading material, or I should say early leveled reading material. Robust language, on the other hand, is sort of that intermediate tier of language where these words are typically uncommon to young children's oral language, but they are frequently used in written text, and that's why it's so important to intentionally teach robust language, is because these are often terms that are found in multiple contexts. These are our adjectives as well as our adverbs and more sophisticated usage. Most of our conversational language is basic nouns and verbs and basic adjectives. Robust language is much more sort of sophisticated and mature, but can also, those are the words that often get in the way when children are reading texts. So they're important for them to know, understand, and use in reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And then, of course, we have our last tier, and that's content-specific language. And this is limited use language. This is what I call contextualized language, language that is important in a specific context. And these are words that are vital to text comprehension when reading, let's say, a trade book in science or a trade book in social studies, where words, if you don't understand the meanings behind these words, it will indeed impede text comprehension and or conceptual development within those. So Beck et al. Give you some suggestions with regard to thinking about the tiers of language, and they oftentimes talk about using that robust tier is where we do most of our teaching, because those are the words that transfer into different contexts. So what are some keys to success with regard to vocabulary teaching? Well, I sort of just summarized everything that you've read about vocabulary for this class and probably have read in other contexts. And that's that notion of using multiple strategies to teach and reinforce vocabulary. And in order to teach words thoroughly, you have to use words in multiple contexts and multiple strategies to do so, as well as provide lots of opportunities for students to use those words in their reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And so we can teach words all day long. We can explicitly teach them and do a beautiful job of it, but if we do not hold students accountable for and provide opportunities for students to use those, then the transference is going to be a lot less than if we do provide opportunities. And of course, we want to introduce words that are appropriate to students' developmental levels and needs, and that is clearly dependent upon the grade that you're teaching in and the types of texts that you're using with children. So with all that said, as far as our best practices for vocabulary instruction, we also sort of turn the tables and think about, okay, how do we assess that instruction? And researchers really believe that assessment of students' vocabulary knowledge should be closely linked to instruction. So you're closely assessing what you're teaching and how you're teaching them. So you should think about the specific goals of instruction. So how you're teaching those vocabulary words is how you should assess them. It makes sense, it really does, but you'd be surprised. Sometimes we give students decontextualized lists of vocabulary that have nothing to do with what they're reading, and we assess them on Fridays just like the good old spelling tests, and there's been very little instruction throughout the week about those vocabulary words, and yet we assess them as if there has been. So we want to be really careful about how we assess students, and you'll find that there are few standardized assessments. The Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test is the most commonly used, but that even those are limited, because even in the PPVT you can only select a small number of words to assess a child on compared to their much larger vocabulary. And third, it's difficult to pin down what is meant by knowing a word. So vocabulary assessment can be tricky, can be very tricky. That's why classroom vocabulary assessment needs to be linked to instruction. I'll say it again, be obnoxious, but it's true. So what are some different vocabulary assessments? Well, obviously, observational data, and that's thinking about conversing with students, engaging in discussions about texts, and keying in and cluing in on the types of words that they are using as they do that. Very much like the oral language observation checklist that you all created last week, thinking about how those types of assessments can help inform understanding vocabulary. Also, clearly teacher-designed tests, vocabulary games, things that are closely linked to instruction are ways to assess vocabulary in the classroom. There are also more formal ways to do that, informal and formal ways. The close procedure that you all found on page 241, if you want to take time to pause the video and really read through the close procedure, and the maze test, which is something very similar to that. That allows you to score giving students independent instructional and frustrational levels, and those are often great screening assessments. Informal reading inventories also allow a little bit of vocabulary assessment with regard to word solving strategies and meaning making strategies. However, it's a little bit more convoluted. Standardized tests such as the PPVT are also ways in which you can assess vocabulary, and these are typically ways that researchers use to, as you saw in the Beck and McCowan study, they use the PPVT. It's kind of our one standardized measurement of vocabulary that's kind of been consistently used over years. PPVT is also used as a screening measure and can be used as a diagnostic measure. It's something that in the reading clinic, when working with children with reading-related learning disabilities, often the PPVT was one of our very first screening measures to see whether or not it was an issue of vocabulary or it was an issue closely tied to phonological processing and decoding. So the PPVT is something very popularly used. However, it is limited, as we said earlier, that there's a certain amount of words on the PPVT used that may not be fully indicative of the child's vocabulary. So what I'd like for you to do right now is I'd like for you to look at Juan. Juan is a third grader that I may have taught. I may have taught Juan and Precious both. I'd like you to read through this case study. I'd like for you to read also through thoroughly through the case study. So it starts here, giving it's also on your online session outline, the case study, and then the assignment that Juan was given, and then his written sample. And then I'd like for you to think about these questions with regard to Juan and answering each of these questions like you did for Precious. One of the best ways that we can think about assessment and instruction is to think about individual case studies and about children, and how we can think about what's established or proficient, developing, emerging, and then how can we provide intentional instruction based on what we know. And then on the flip side, what can we do to find out if we know what we're doing is indeed working. So take time right now to look at Juan's case study and to answer the questions on the outline session about Juan. Finally, I'm going to conclude this PowerPoint session with two resources that have been particularly helpful for me with regard to both fluency and vocabulary instruction. The first one is Research-Based Methods of Reading Instruction. This was a resource that I discovered when I was working in the Texas A&M Reading Clinic, and it's great for grades K through 3. It really sort of spells out the components of the National Reading Panel and gives some ideas for instruction. And then the next one is Bringing Words to Life by Isabella Beck, Margaret McCowan, and Linda Kukin. And this is one of those texts that every teacher should have on their bookshelf with regard to teaching vocabulary. Beck et al. Give just incredible not only help you understand the rationale for robust vocabulary instruction or rich vocabulary instruction, but also gives you a framework for introducing vocabulary, developing vocabulary in early grades, developing it in later grades, as well as making the most of your teaching contextualized teaching of vocabulary. So it's not an expensive text, and I would highly recommend buying that. Neither of them are expensive, and I think you'll find them to be helpful tools. So that concludes this PowerPoint. If you have any questions, let me know. Send me an email or give me a call. Also, please be sure to do your postings by Sunday night at 11:59 p.m. Your initial posting to my questions, and then in the next couple days after that, please post to a classmate.